battle-scarred alien goes rigid after learning what humans survived in battle. Part 2. The Record Room. The next morning, Vrethkal arrived at the human archive room exactly on time. He had not slept well. The bed was too soft, the air too warm, and the silence of the station irritated him. On Draven warships, there was always noise, the hum of engines, the clatter of weapons being maintained, the low growling conversations of soldiers who never fully relaxed. Here, everything was calm and quiet, and it made his scales itch. Nate was already there, standing beside a long table with a data terminal built into its surface. Lisa sat at the far end, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The room itself was plain. Gray walls, soft overhead lighting, a row of display screens along one side. Nothing about it suggested it contained anything remarkable. Vrethkal sat down heavily. The chair groaned under his weight. Yashri took her place, standing behind him, as was her custom. "Let us begin," Vrethkal said. "The compact assessment requires a full accounting of your species' military history. I want to know what you have fought, what you have survived, and what you have lost." He said it the way he had said it to a dozen other species before. It was routine, a formality. Most younger species had short, modest records. A border skirmish here, a civil conflict there. Nothing that would take more than an hour to review. Nate nodded and activated the terminal. A soft blue light filled the surface of the table. "I should tell you up front, Commander, that our military history is long. Humans have been fighting wars for thousands of years, long before we ever reached space. I will try to focus on the events most relevant to the compact's criteria." Vrethkal waved a claw. "Start wherever you like. I doubt it will take long." He simply pulled up the first set of records and began. About 110 years before humans achieved faster-than-light travel, our species fought a global conflict we call the First World War. It involved dozens of nations across our home planet and killed roughly 20 million people. Vrethkal blinked. That was a larger number than he expected. But he said nothing, and let Nate continue. Nate described the trenches, long, narrow ditches carved into the earth, where soldiers lived for months and sometimes years at a time. He explained that these trenches stretched for hundreds of miles across entire continents. The soldiers inside them slept in mud. They ate cold food out of metal cans. Rats the size of small animals crawled over them at night. Disease spread through the lines constantly, killing men just as surely as enemy fire. Then Nate told him about the gas. Both sides developed chemical weapons, he said, keeping his voice steady and even. Chlorine gas, phosgene, mustard gas. These chemicals burned the lungs, blistered the skin, and blinded soldiers who could not get their protective masks on in time. Mustard gas was the worst. It did not kill quickly. It burned the body slowly, inside and out. Men who breathed it often took days to die, drowning in the fluid that filled their own lungs. Vrethkal's claws curled against the surface of the table. Among the Draven, the use of chemical weapons was considered one of the lowest acts any species could commit. It was grounds for exile, for total exclusion from civilized space. Entire species had been condemned for it. "Your people use these weapons on each other?" he asked, and the soldiers who survived the gas attacks went back to the front lines and kept fighting. Vrethkal stared at him. He did not speak for a long moment. Nate moved on. He brought up the second global conflict, which humans called the Second World War. He explained that it came barely 20 years after the first one ended. "This war killed approximately 60 million people," Nate said. The number hit Vrethkal like a physical blow. 60 million. That was more than the entire population of some species in the compact. He had fought in campaigns that destroyed civilizations, but the numbers Nate was describing came from a single planet, one world, one species killing itself in numbers that most galactic wars never reached. Nate described the Battle of Stalingrad, a city reduced to rubble, where two massive armies fought for nearly 6 months, in conditions that defied reason. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers ate rats, leather from their boots, and anything else they could find. They fought room to room, building to building, sometimes floor to floor, within the same shattered structure. Snipers hid in the ruins and waited for days without moving, lying in the cold, with frozen fingers on their triggers. He described the beaches of Normandy. Thousands of young soldiers, loaded into small boats, and sent across a cold, rough sea toward a coastline lined with machine guns, artillery, and fortified bunkers. The first waves of men were cut down almost immediately. The water turned red, the sand was covered with bodies, and still, more boats came. More men jumped into the water and ran toward the guns. Many of these soldiers were not professional warriors, Nate said quietly. They were ordinary people, farmers, teachers, factory workers, students. They were drafted, pulled from their normal lives, and handed weapons. Some had never fired a gun before their training began. And they charged those beaches, knowing most of them would die before they reached the sand. Yashri shifted behind Vrethkal. He could hear the faint click of her claws tightening. Vrethkal sat perfectly still. His yellow eyes had not blinked in over a minute. Lisa leaned forward. "If I may add something, Commander." He gave a slow nod. Lisa spoke about the medical side of these wars. She described battlefield surgeries performed in muddy tents with basic tools, sometimes without any pain relief at all. She described medics, many of them barely adults themselves, who crawled across open ground under heavy fire to reach wounded soldiers and drag them to safety. She talked about field hospitals that ran out of supplies, out of blood, out of bandages, but never stopped operating. Doctors performed amputations by lantern light. Nurses held dying men's hands and told them they were going to be fine, even when everyone in the room knew they were not. The survival rate for serious battlefield injuries in these conflicts was terrible by modern standards, Lisa said. But the effort that went into saving every single life was extraordinary. No one was left to die if there was even the smallest chance of saving them. Vrethkal's jaw tightened. He could feel something building in his chest, a pressure he did not recognize and did not like. It sat between his hearts like a stone. He asked the question before he could stop himself. How old were these soldiers? Nate looked at him steadily. The minimum age for service was usually 18, but many lied about their age to enlist. Some were 16. A few were younger. The room went completely silent. Vrethkal did not move. His scales had gone darker, a stress response his body produced without his permission. These were children, by almost any species standard. Sent into gas, into freezing rubble, into machine gun fire on open beaches. And they went. They went because their world asked them to, and they did not say no. He looked at Nate, then at Lisa, then at the data still glowing softly on the table. He had come into this room expecting to spend an hour reviewing a short and unremarkable military record. He had expected to confirm what he already believed, that humans were too young, too soft, and too inexperienced to belong among the warriors of the Compact. Instead, he sat in his chair with his claws pressed into the table and a heaviness in his chest that he could not name. And they had only shown him 2 wars, 2 conflicts from a species that, according to the records, had fought hundreds. We can stop here for today if you prefer, Commander, Nate offered. His voice was gentle, not weak, the voice of someone who understood what the information was doing and was not going to push. Vrethkal stood, his chair scraped against the floor. He looked at Nate for a long moment, and for the first time since arriving on the station, there was no dismissal in his eyes. there was something else. Something he was not ready to name. Tomorrow, he said. Show me more tomorrow. He turned and walked out of the room. Yashri followed, her footsteps quick and tight. Neither of them spoke. Nate and Lisa sat in the quiet room for a while after they left. The data terminal still glowed softly on the table between them. Lisa let out a long, slow breath. He was not ready for that. Nate shook his head. No one ever is. Battle-scarred alien goes rigid after learning what humans survived in battle. Part 3. The Thing That Breaks Him. Vrethkal did not sleep that night either. He stood at the viewport in his quarters and stared at the stars, without seeing them. The numbers kept turning over in his mind. 20 million, 60 million, chemical weapons used on their own kind. Children sent to die on frozen battlefields and burning beaches. And the humans had shown him this information calmly. Nate had not raised his voice. Lisa had not cried. They had spoken about the deaths of millions, the way someone might describe the weather. Not because they did not care, but because they had carried this knowledge for so long that it had become part of them, like bones beneath the skin. He told himself it did not change anything. Numbers were just numbers. Every species had ugly chapters in its past. The Draven had burned worlds during the expansion wars. They had done terrible things and learned to live with the memory. But something about the way the humans spoke about their dead bothered him in a way he could not explain. When morning came, he went back to the archive room. Nate was there, as before. Lisa sat in her usual spot. But today, there was someone new at the table. Pete Harlan sat with his thick arms resting on the surface, his pale blue eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He looked like a man who had been asked to do something he did not especially want to do, but had agreed to do it anyway. Vrethkal sat down. Yashri took her place behind him. I asked Sergeant Harlan to join us today, Nate said. What I want to show you next is not just history from a book. Pete has a personal connection to the kind of fighting I am going to describe, not from the same war, but from the same tradition. Vrethkal looked at Pete. Pete looked back. There was a brief, silent exchange between them, the kind that happens between two people who have both seen combat and do not need words to recognize it in each other. Nate pulled up a new set of records on the terminal. The display showed a frozen mountain range on the human homeworld, a place called the Chosen Reservoir. The images were old and grainy, captured in a primitive visual format. They showed snow-covered ridges, narrow dirt roads carved through steep valleys, and clusters of military vehicles frozen in place like metal corpses. This happened during a conflict called the Korean War, Nate began. A force of roughly 15,000 Marines and soldiers was deployed deep into mountainous enemy territory. Their mission was to advance north, but intelligence had failed them. They did not know that over 60,000 enemy combatants had moved into the mountains around them and were preparing to attack from all sides. Vrethkal listened. 4-1 odds. Bad, but not unheard of. He had faced worse during the Bleeding Corridor. What mattered was what happened next. The attack came at night, Nate continued. The enemy poured down from the mountains in massive waves. The temperature had already dropped to nearly 40 degrees below zero. Everything was freezing. Weapons jammed because the lubricant in the firing mechanisms turned to ice. Morphine froze in its tubes. Blood plasma froze in its bags. The medical teams could not use their own supplies. Pete spoke for the first time. His voice was flat and unhurried, like a man reading directions off a map. The medics started putting the morphine syringes in their mouths, he said, held them under their tongues to warm them up enough to inject into the wounded. They did this while enemy rounds were hitting the ground around them. They knelt in the snow beside dying men, with frozen hands and frozen medicine, and they kept working. Vrethkal's eyes moved to Pete. The human did not look emotional. He did not look sad or proud or angry. He looked like someone stating simple facts that he wished were not true, but knew could not be changed. Nate continued the account. The Marines were surrounded. Supply lines were cut. Reinforcements could not reach them. The enemy attacked in waves, night after night, using the darkness and the cold as weapons. Human soldiers stood in foxholes so shallow they barely covered their knees, firing their weapons until the barrels warped from heat, while the rest of their bodies turned numb from cold. Men who fell asleep sometimes did not wake up. The cold killed them silently where they sat. They fought for 17 days, Nate said. And when it became clear that they could not complete their advance, their commanding officer made a decision. He ordered a fighting withdrawal south, back to the coast, where ships were waiting. Vrethkal nodded slowly. A retreat. It was not shameful. Retreat, in the face of overwhelming numbers, was a sound tactical decision. Even the Draven understood that. But Pete shook his head slightly. It was not a retreat, Pete said. The commanding officer made that very clear. When a reporter asked him about retreating, he said they were not retreating. He said they were advancing in a different direction. The words hung in the air for a moment. Vrethkal tilted his head. He did not understand the distinction. Moving away from the enemy was retreat, regardless of what words you wrapped around it. But Nate explained. The difference was in how they did it. They did not abandon their positions and run. They fought their way out, mile by mile, through enemy forces that outnumbered them 4-1. They held defensive lines, counterattacked when necessary, destroyed equipment they could not carry so the enemy would not use it, and they moved south as a disciplined, organized force. And they carried their dead with them, Pete added. Vrethkal's claws stopped moving. Every body, Pete said, every single fallen soldier. They loaded them onto trucks, onto tanks, onto anything that could hold them. When vehicles broke down, they carried them on stretchers. When stretchers broke, they carried them on their backs, through snow, through ice, through enemy fire, through wind so cold it killed men where they stood. The room was completely still. Vrethkal felt something happening to his body. His scales had begun to lock. It was an involuntary response, something deep in Draven biology that activated when the body sensed a threat so large, so overwhelming, that it prepared itself for death. The scales hardened, flattened against each other, and interlocked into a rigid shell. It was a survival mechanism from ancient times, when Draven ancestors faced predators too large to fight. But there was no predator here. There was no threat. There was only a quiet room with 3 humans and a story about frozen mountains and men who would not leave their dead behind. Yashri saw the scale lock happening and reached toward him, her hand stopping just short of his shoulder. Among the Draven, touching someone in that state was a serious thing. It meant you were either pulling them out of danger or preparing to die beside them. Vrethkal raised one clawed hand, stopping her. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on Pete. "Did they survive?" he asked. His voice was different now. The deep, commanding rumble was gone. What remained was quieter. Like something had scraped the inside of his throat raw. Pete met his gaze without flinching. Most of them made it out. They broke through the enemy lines and reached the coast, and they brought their wounded and their dead with them. Vrethkal repeated the words slowly, as though testing their weight. They carried their dead. Pete nodded once. "We do not leave our people behind. That is not a regulation. That is not a rule someone wrote in a book. It is just what we do. It is what we have always done." Vrethkal sat in his locked scales and said nothing for a long time. The blue light from the terminal reflected off his rigid, darkened hide. His yellow eyes did not blink. His chest barely moved with each breath. He was not looking at Pete anymore. He was looking at something far away, something inside himself that he had believed was complete and unshakable. a lifetime of war and survival and scars that he thought had taught him everything there was to know about what it meant to endure. He was realizing slowly and with great discomfort that he had been wrong. Finally, without a word, he stood. His scales remained locked, which meant his body moved stiffly, like a statue coming to life. He walked to the door, paused, and stood there with his back to the room. "Tomorrow," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. He did not finish the sentence. He simply walked out. Yashri followed him quickly, casting one brief look back at the humans before the door closed behind her. Nate, Lisa, and Pete sat in the silence. Pete stared at the table for a long time. Then he rubbed his face with both hands and let out a breath that seemed to empty him completely. "I think we broke him," he said quietly. Nate shook his head. "He is not broken. He is just seeing us for the first time." Lisa looked at the door where Vrethkal had stood moments before. "Did you see his scales? I have read about the Draven lock response. It only happens when their body thinks they are about to die." Pete looked at her. He was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of what we are. The room had no answer for that. Battle-scarred alien goes rigid after learning what humans survived in battle. Part 4. What scars really mean. Vrethkal did not come to the scheduled diplomatic dinner that evening. His quarters remained sealed, and when the station system pinged his room with a polite reminder about the meal, the notification went unanswered. Yashri stood outside his door for a long time, her arms folded behind her back. She could hear nothing from inside. No movement, no sound of breathing, just silence. She knew what was happening. She had seen it once before, years ago, when a much younger Vrethkal had returned from a mission on a world called Drevnathal, where he had been forced to kill a fellow Draven commander who had gone mad and turned on their own soldiers. For 3 days after that mission, Vrethkal had sealed himself away and spoken to no one. The Draven called it Vielthun. It was not meditation, at least not in the gentle, peaceful sense that other species use the word. It was a deep internal reckoning, a state that Draven warriors entered when something they had witnessed was so far outside their understanding that their mind needed to tear down old structures of belief and build new ones in their place. It was painful, it was slow, and it could not be interrupted without causing serious harm. Yashri remained at her post. Around the same time, Nate and Lisa arrived at the mess hall and found Pete already sitting in a corner booth, his prosthetic legs stretched out under the table. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him, but had not touched it. The surface had gone still and cold. Nate sat down across from him. Lisa took the seat beside Nate. "He did not come to dinner," Nate said. Pete nodded without looking up. "I figured he would not." Lisa looked between them. "I sent a message to Yashri. She said the commander has entered something called Vielthun. She says it is a deep trance state and that he should not be disturbed." Nate leaned back. "Did she say how long it might last?" "She was not specific. She said it depends on the warrior and on the weight of what triggered it. It could be hours, it could be a full day." Pete finally looked up. His blue eyes were tired. "Do you think we pushed too hard?" Nate considered the question carefully. He had been thinking about it since the briefing ended, replaying the moments in his mind. The way Vrethkal's claws had gripped the table during the World War II descriptions. The way his body had gone rigid when Pete told him about the dead being carried through the snow. The sound of his voice cracking on a single word before he walked out the door. "He asked to see our records," Nate said. "He asked the standard compact question. We answered it honestly. That is all we can do." Pete wrapped his hands around the cold coffee cup and stared into it. The thing that always gets them is not the dying. Every species out here has warriors who are willing to die. That is not special. Dying is easy. You get hit, you go down, it is over. He paused. What gets them is the suffering. The slow, grinding, endless suffering, and the fact that we kept going through it. That is the part they cannot understand. Not the willingness to die, the willingness to suffer that much and still choose to live, still choose to fight, still choose to carry someone else on your back when your own legs are barely working. Lisa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When I was a combat medic on Dustvale, before I moved to the diplomatic corps, I treated a Marine who had taken shrapnel through both legs and one arm. He couldn't walk. He could barely move. And the first thing he said to me when I reached him was not about his wounds. He said there was another Marine 50 meters to his left who was hurt worse, and I should go to her first." She paused. He did not even know if the other Marine was still alive, but he wanted me to check before I treated him. Pete nodded slowly. That is the thing they do not have a word for. The Draven, the Valkyrie, the Shen, all the big warrior cultures out here, they have honor and courage and duty. They have words for all of that. But they do not have a word for what we do. The thing where you are broken and bleeding and freezing, and you still reach out to help the person next to you. Where the pain does not make you selfish. It makes you hold on tighter to everyone around you. They sat with that for a while. The mess hall was mostly empty. A few crew members from other species passed through, collecting food trays and moving on. The hum of the station filled the silence like a low, constant heartbeat. Meanwhile, Yashri still stood outside Vrethkal's door. She had not moved in over 2 hours. Her training allowed her to remain still for extended periods, but it was not discipline that kept her there. It was concern. She had served with Vrethkal for over 15 cycles. She had watched him fight, bleed, command, and grieve. She had seen him cut through enemies with his bare claws and then sit quietly afterward and recite the names of every soldier he had lost that day. She knew him better than anyone alive, and she had never seen him enter Vaelthun from words alone. Every other time it had happened, it was because of something physical. A battle lost, a warrior killed, a wound that went too deep. But this time, nothing had touched him. No blade, no weapon, no enemy. Just 3 humans, sitting at a table, telling him what their species had survived. When Lisa came to check on the situation later that evening, Yashri was still standing in the corridor. Lisa approached carefully, holding 2 cups of warm tea that she had prepared in the mess hall. "Is he all right?" Lisa asked softly. Yashri looked at her for a long moment. Her amber eyes were difficult to read, but there was something in them that Lisa recognized. It was the look of someone trying to explain something that did not translate easily between languages or cultures. "Among my people," Yashri began, "scars are the highest form of proof. They are proof that a warrior faced death and survived. We wear them openly. We are proud of them. The more scars you carry, the more you have earned the right to stand among the strong." Lisa nodded. "Nate mentioned that during our preparation briefings." Yashri continued, "But what your people described to the commander, the things your soldiers endured, that was not just surviving wounds. That was surviving conditions that should have destroyed the will to fight entirely. Cold that kills the body, poison that burns the lungs, starvation, watching thousands die around you and still choosing to stand up and move forward. Still choosing to carry the dead on your backs because leaving them behind was something you simply would not do." She paused, and her voice dropped lower. "We have scars on our bodies. Your people have scars somewhere deeper, somewhere we cannot see. And the commander is struggling with that, because in our culture, if you cannot see the wound, it does not exist. But your wounds are real. They are immense, and you carry them so quietly that he almost missed them entirely." Lisa stood still, holding the 2 cups of tea, and felt something tighten in her chest. Yashri took a slow breath. He is not troubled because your species is weak. He is troubled because your species may be stronger than anything we have ever encountered, and you do not even seem to know it. You walk around this station smiling, making jokes about the food, shaking hands with open palms. And underneath all of that, you carry a history of suffering that would have broken most of the species in the compact. Lisa did not know what to say to that. She held out one of the cups of tea. Yashri looked at it, confused. "It is warm," Lisa said simply, "and it is a long night." Yashri hesitated. Then she reached out with her clawed hand and carefully took the cup. She held it for a moment, feeling the warmth seep through her scales, and gave a small nod. They stood together in the quiet corridor, two soldiers from two very different worlds, holding warm cups and waiting for a warrior to finish reckoning with the kind of strength he had never imagined existed. Inside the sealed room, Vrethkal sat on the floor in the darkness and let the weight of it crush him. He let every story, every number, every detail strip away the certainty he had carried for 40 cycles of war. And slowly, painfully, he began to rebuild. Battle-scarred alien goes rigid after learning what humans survived in battle. Part 5. A place at the table. The door to Vrethkal's quarters opened at dawn. Yashri was still there. She had not slept. She had remained standing in the corridor through the entire night, her back straight, her claws folded behind her, watching the sealed door the way a sentinel watches a gate. When the door finally slid open, she straightened and turned to face him. Vrethkal stepped out. He looked the same towering frame, same scarred scales, same deep-set yellow eyes, but something had shifted behind those eyes. The hardness was still there, but it had been reshaped. The arrogance, the casual dismissal, the certainty that he already knew everything worth knowing about strength and survival, all of that was gone. In its place was something quieter. Something that looked a lot like respect. He looked at Yashri and gave a single slow nod. "Gather the humans," he said. "I wish to speak with them." Yashri did not ask questions. She turned and walked toward the communications panel on the wall to send the message. Vrethkal stood alone in the corridor and took a deep breath. The recycled air of the station filled his lungs. It tasted like metal and filtered moisture. It tasted like nothing. But he breathed it in as though it were the first breath he had taken in days, and maybe it was. An hour later, the four of them gathered in the same archive room where everything had begun. The data terminal was off. The screens were dark. The room felt different, without the soft blue glow of records and casualty figures filling the air. It felt simpler. Just a room with a table and chairs and 5 beings standing inside it. Nate stood near the table, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. Lisa was beside him, her posture calm and professional, though her eyes kept glancing at Vrethkal with a careful attention that suggested she was watching for signs of how he was doing. Pete leaned against the far wall with his arms crossed. His weight shifted to his good leg, saying nothing and expecting nothing. Vrethkal entered last. Yashri walked in behind him and positioned herself to his right, standing at attention. There was a formality to her posture that had not been there before. Her chin was lifted, her shoulders squared, and her hands were pressed flat against her thighs. It was a Draven ceremonial stance, the kind used for moments of great importance. Nate noticed it, but said nothing. Vrethkal stood at the head of the table and looked at each of the humans in turn. He looked at Nate first, the man who had walked him through hell with a steady voice and gentle eyes. Then, at Lisa, the medic who understood suffering from the inside and still chose to face it every day. Then at Pete, the wounded Marine who carried a missing leg and an unbroken spirit with equal ease. He took a breath. Then he reached down to his belt and drew a blade. It was not a combat weapon. It was smaller, thinner, with a handle wrapped in dark leather and a short curved edge that caught the overhead light. Lisa recognized it immediately from her pre-mission cultural briefings. It was a Draven ceremonial knife, a veil blade, used only in rituals of deep personal significance. Draven warriors carried them their entire lives, but rarely used them. Some never did. Lisa took a step forward on instinct. Her medical training pulled her toward the blade, toward the possibility of injury, toward the need to help. But Yashri reached out and placed a gentle hand on her arm, stopping her. "This is important." Vrethkal held the blade in his right hand. He turned his left forearm upward, exposing the softer scales along the inner side, where the skin was thinner and more sensitive. And in one slow, deliberate motion, he drew the blade across his own flesh. The cut was precise, a thin, straight line, no longer than the width of his palm. Dark blood, nearly black, welled up from the wound and ran down the inside of his arm in a single slow stream. He did not wince. He did not flinch. He watched the blood with the same steady gaze he had once used to watch battlefields burn. Then he looked up at the humans. "Among my people, every scar is earned in battle. Every mark on a Draven body is proof that an enemy tried to kill us and failed. We do not wound ourselves. We do not mark our own skin. A scar given by your own hand carries no honor." The blood continued to run slowly down his forearm and drip onto the floor in small, dark drops. But there is one exception, one scar that a warrior may give to themselves. It is called the Veil Run, the Scar of Recognition. It is given when a warrior has witnessed something that has fundamentally changed their understanding of strength. Something so profound that their old self could not contain it, and a new self had to be built. He held up his bleeding arm so they could see the wound clearly. "This scar is for you, for your species, for every human who ever stood in a frozen trench with poison in the air and chose to keep breathing. For every child who lied about their age and walked onto a battlefield because their world needed them. For every soldier who charged into gunfire on an open beach knowing they would not survive. For every Marine who carried a dead friend through the snow because leaving them behind was something they simply would not do." His voice did not waver. It was low and rough and full of something that none of them had heard from him before. It was not pity. It was not fear. It was reverence. "I came here to judge whether your species was strong enough for the compact. I asked the standard questions. I expected standard answers. Instead, you showed me a history of suffering that should have ground your species into dust 100 times over. And here you stand, smiling, shaking hands, making jokes about the food, carrying your scars so deep inside that I almost made the mistake of thinking you had none." He lowered his arm and looked directly at Nate. "Your species does not wear its wounds the way we do. You do not mark your skin with proof of what you survived. You carry it somewhere else. In your stories. In the way you refuse to stop. In the way you look at the worst thing that has ever happened and say, well, we are still here, so we might as well keep going." Pete shifted his weight slightly against the wall. His expression had not changed, but his jaw was set in a way that suggested he was holding something down. Lisa's eyes were shining, though her face remained steady. Vrethkal turned to Yashri. "Log my recommendation." Yashri straightened. Her claws trembled slightly as she activated the recording device on her wrist. "Humanity is to be granted full membership in the Galactic Shield Compact," Vrethkal said. His voice was formal, carrying the weight of a declaration that would be entered into the permanent records of every species in the Alliance. Not as probationary members, not as junior partners, as equals, with all rights, responsibilities, and honors afforded to any founding species. Yashri recorded the words. Her amber eyes were wide, and her breathing was uneven, but her hands were steady. Vrethkal turned back to the humans for the last time. He let the silence hold for a moment, then spoke in a voice that carried the full weight of 40 years of war, 9 star systems, and a lifetime of scars. I have fought longer than most warriors live. I have killed and bled and buried soldiers I loved. I have watched worlds burn and walked through the ashes. I believe that I understood what it meant to endure. He paused. I was wrong. I have never encountered a species that survives the way you do. Not because you are harder to kill, though you may be, but because you simply refuse to stop being alive. You refuse to stop caring. You refuse to stop carrying each other, even when the weight should have crushed you long ago. The room was so quiet that the hum of the station sounded like a roar. Nate stepped forward and extended his hand. This time, Vrethkal did not hesitate. He reached out and wrapped his clawed fingers around Nate's hand. The grip was firm on both sides. Human skin against Draven scales. 2 very different kinds of strength meeting in the middle. Welcome to the compact, Vrethkal said. Nate smiled, the same easy, warm smile he had worn since the very first moment they met. Glad to be here, Commander. Pete pushed off the wall and gave a single, quiet nod. No words, no grand gesture, just one soldier acknowledging another. It was enough. Lisa wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, and pretended she had not. Then she stepped forward and, without thinking, placed her hand briefly on Vrethkal's wounded forearm. Her fingers rested beside the cut, not on it, just next to it. A medic's instinct wrapped in something deeper. Vrethkal looked down at her hand, then at her face. He did not pull away. That will scar well, she said softly. Yes, he said. It will. Yashri stepped forward and pressed her closed fist against her chest. The Draven salute. But she directed it not at Vrethkal. She directed it at the 3 humans standing before her. They did not know the proper response, so Nate simply nodded. Pete raised a hand. Lisa smiled. It was clumsy and imperfect, and it did not follow any protocol from either species. It was exactly right. Later, after the room had emptied, and the corridor lights had dimmed to their nighttime setting, the archive room sat quiet and dark. The data terminal was still off. The screens were still blank. But somewhere in the station's vast digital memory, the records waited. Chosen. Normandy. Stalingrad. The trenches of the First Great War. The beaches of the Second. 100 other battles fought by a species that had been killing and saving and carrying and refusing to quit since the first moment it learned to stand on 2 legs. The records did not care whether anyone read them. They simply existed, patient and permanent, ready for the next visitor who dared to ask the question that Vrethkal had asked. What have the humans survived? The answer, as it turned out, was everything. Battle-scarred alien goes rigid after learning what humans survived in battle. Part 1. The Hall of Scars. The docking clamps locked into place with a deep metallic groan that echoed through the entire corridor. The station shuddered once, then went still. A moment later, the airlock doors slid open with a sharp hiss, and Commander Vrethkal of the Draven Empire stepped aboard Bastion Reach. He was enormous, nearly 8 feet tall, his body covered in thick dark green scales that had long since lost their shine. Deep scars ran across every visible part of him. One cut diagonally across his face, splitting the ridge above his left eye, and pulling the skin into a permanent scowl. Another wrapped around his neck like a collar made of healed flesh. His hands, each tipped with 4 curved black claws, bore so many old wounds that the scales had grown back in uneven ridges, rough as tree bark. Among his people, scars were not something to hide. Every wound, told a story. Every mark on a Draven body was proof that the warrior had faced death and come back from it. The more scars a warrior carried, the more respected they became, and Vrethkal carried more than almost anyone alive. He had fought in the Siege of Hollow Nebula, a campaign that lasted 3 years and left 2 moons shattered into dust. He had survived the Bleeding Corridor, a series of brutal engagements along a contested trade route, where 3 entire species were wiped from existence. He had personally killed enemy commanders in close combat, felt their blood on his claws, and walked away with new scars each time. Now the Galactic Shield Compact had sent him here. His mission was simple: evaluate the humans, decide if they were worthy of joining the most elite military alliance in known space. Vrethkal had his doubts. Behind him walked Sub-Commander Yashri, his second in command. She was smaller than Vrethkal, but no less dangerous. Her scales were a lighter shade of green, almost gray at the edges, and her scars, while fewer, were placed in spots that told their own grim stories. One long mark ran from her jaw down to her collarbone. She had earned it, fighting a Krethva ambush team at close range, alone, after her entire squad had been killed. Yashri said nothing as they walked. She rarely did, unless she had something worth saying. The human delegation was waiting for them at the end of the corridor, 3 of them. Vrethkal studied them the way a predator studies unfamiliar animals at a watering hole. The first was a man of average height and build, wearing a clean gray uniform with a few pins on the collar. His brown hair was cut short, and his face was calm and open. He smiled when Vrethkal approached and extended his hand. "Commander Vrethkal, welcome aboard Bastion Reach. I will be your primary liaison during your stay." Vrethkal looked at the hand. Among the Draven, a greeting was done by pressing a closed fist against the chest, over the heart. He did not take Nate's hand. He simply stared at him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Nate lowered his hand without any sign of offense. His smile did not waver. "This is Dr. Lisa Morrow," Nate continued, gesturing to the woman beside him. She was shorter, with dark red hair pulled back in a tight knot. Her eyes were sharp and attentive, and she carried herself with a kind of quiet steadiness that Vrethkal noticed but chose to ignore. "She is a combat medic and our diplomatic medical advisor." Lisa gave a polite nod. "Commander." "And this is Gunnery Sergeant Pete Harlan," Nate said, turning to the third human. Pete was different from the other 2. He was broad across the shoulders and thick through the arms, built like someone who had spent his entire life carrying heavy things. His jaw was square, and his eyes were a flat pale blue that did not blink much. He stood slightly off balance, and Vrethkal's trained gaze immediately picked up the reason. The man's left leg was slightly different from his right, prosthetic, below the knee. Pete did not try to hide it. Pete gave a short nod. Nothing more. Vrethkal studied him for a second longer than the others. A wounded warrior. That, at least, was something he understood. The group walked through the station as Nate explained the layout. Bastion Reach was a joint coalition station, home to representatives from over a dozen species. It served as neutral ground for diplomatic discussions, military assessments, and trade negotiations. The corridors were wide enough to accommodate species of various sizes, and the lighting shifted subtly between sections to match the preferences of different inhabitants. Vrethkal listened, but said little. He was watching how the humans moved, how they spoke, how they carried themselves, and he was not impressed. Nate walked with an easy stride, like a man on a pleasant afternoon stroll. He made small talk, pointed out features of the station, and even cracked a mild joke about the food in the mess hall. Lisa walked beside him, occasionally adding details with a calm, professional tone. Pete limped along at the back, quiet and unhurried. None of them moved like warriors. None of them had the tension in their bodies that Vrethkal expected from a species trying to prove itself to the compact. They seemed relaxed, almost casual. That evening, after the humans had shown them to their quarters and left, Vrethkal stood by the viewport and looked out at the stars. Yashri stood behind him, waiting. "They are soft," Vrethkal said. His voice was low, a deep rumble that vibrated in his chest. "Too comfortable. Too friendly. I have seen prey animals with more edge than these humans." Yashri tilted her head. The one with the damaged leg, he did not seem soft. "One wounded soldier does not make a species worthy of the compact," Vrethkal replied. "The compact demands strength, endurance, a willingness to bleed and keep bleeding until the enemy is dust. These humans smile too much. They talk too much. I do not trust a species that greets a stranger with an open hand instead of a closed fist." He turned away from the viewport. "I will complete the assessment as ordered, but I already know what my recommendation will be." She had served with Vrethkal long enough to know when he had made up his mind. And she had served with him long enough to know that sometimes his mind changed in ways he never expected. Outside, in the corridor, Nate Colby stood leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He had not meant to overhear. The translator embedded in the station walls had picked up fragments of the conversation and projected them through a small speaker near the doorway, a glitch that the maintenance crew had been meaning to fix for weeks. He had heard enough. The words soft and prey animals came through clearly. Nate did not look angry. He did not look offended. He simply stood there for a moment, staring at the floor with a small, quiet smile on his face. Then he pushed off the wall, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the mess hall. "Give it time, Commander," he murmured to himself. "Give it time."